you so much. Thank you all for being here to hear from me and from all these other great speakers. As I mentioned, I'm Sylvester Johnson. I'm the National Volunteer Manager and Georgia Coalition Coordinator here at Vote Riders. And today I have a quick presentation just to tell you a little bit more about the work that we do at Vote Riders, the impact that it has on you all specifically as students, and how you can make sure that you, your classmates, your friends, your families are prepared to make sure their voice is heard in this upcoming election. And so if you have any questions for me, feel free to drop those into the chat throughout the presentation. I'll make sure that I get to those. And then if not, I will definitely cover them after I finish that. But for now, I'm going to share my screen. Awesome. And so again, I work for Vote Riders. We focus on voter ID. So I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the work that we do and the impact that it has on voters in Georgia. Vote Riders has been an organization for 10 years. We were founded in April of 2012, and we make sure that we're educating folks about voter ID laws across the country and also assisting folks that need help getting that ID. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit 501c3. So that means anyone who reaches out to us, anyone who needs voter ID assistance, has questions, we will provide that to them. The way that we're able to do this work in Georgia and then nationwide as well is because we have over 1,000 plus partners, over 8,000 volunteers who step up in different capacities to make sure that we're building the footprint of Vote Riders across the country. And so just a little more about voter ID and why it's such an issue. It's not easy for a lot of folks in Georgia, especially African Americans, voters of color, to get voter ID. And voter ID is required in the state of Georgia if you're voting by mail or voting in person. Some of these barriers related to getting ID can include cost, no access to the DDS, they may not have transportation, and then they may not have key documents. And here at Vote Riders, we help folks facilitate and help cover all of those expenses. We never want a financial issue to be a reason why someone doesn't have the ID and why they're not able to be able to vote. Having that ID is so essential, not just to being able to cast your ballot eventually, but also to making sure that you're able to secure housing, secure healthcare, even access to children's school or whatever the case may be. So we want to make sure that we're removing that hurdle from folks' lives so that they can, of course, ultimately vote, but so they can do those other things as well. The fight is not over. We have a slide coming up that talks a little bit about the changes we've seen around voter ID across the country, but specifically here in Georgia, and how we got to continue to fight, continue to make sure voters are prepared and knowledgeable about these changes so when they occur, they know how to successfully cast their ballot. And this number that you're seeing on your screen speaks to the importance of making sure that folks have the ID they need. Over 25 million voting age Americans don't have a current government issued photo ID. So living here in Georgia, which is a strict voter ID state, that can definitely and will hinder you from being part of the voting process. And then it's just so entrenched in other places across the country as well. So we're making sure that folks have that ID that they need. And so through the work that we've done here at Vote Riders, the traction that our staff on the ground gets, our website, stats that we get from other organizations, these are the folks we know who are most impacted by voter ID laws. African-American voters, 1 in 4 voting age African-Americans do not have a current government issued photo ID. Hispanic voters, women voters who may have changed their name either due to marriage or divorce, so what's on their registration may not match what's on their ID. Voters with disabilities, young and student voters like yourself. We'll talk a little bit more about how you are specifically impacted here in the state of Georgia. Voters 65 and plus who may no longer have a driver's license, and any voter ID state, that state's driver's license or a state ID is the most common form of voter ID. Transgender and non-binary voters, indigenous voters, and AAPI voters. And so when we were saying that folks are impacted across the board, this is what we're talking about. And these are the folks that we reach out to and want to ensure that they have what they need to successfully cast the ballot. And one reason why some voter ID is tricky to folks because confusion can be widespread. There's several reasons why confusion can be widespread when you're talking about voter ID. One of those could be because these laws are constantly changing. Again, we've seen a lot of changes across the United States related to voter ID. We've seen changes in Georgia related to voter ID since the 2020 election. Voter ID laws can be different whether you're voting by mail or voting in person. However someone chooses to exercise their right to vote. We want to make sure they know the exact steps they need to take to successfully cast that ballot. And then lastly, poll workers are just like me and you. Sometimes they may not be knowledgeable about all the acceptable forms of ID. They may not be aware of some of the changes. So we're making sure here at Vote Riders that we outfit that voter with the information so that if they run into any hurdles, they know how to navigate that. And so now what you're seeing on your screen is a map of the voter ID laws across the country. We're going to go through that quickly. If you look at states in the lightest color green, states like California, states like Nevada, these are no voter ID states. So once you have participated in your first federal election, you should not be asked to show ID when you go to the polls. If you move over to states in the medium color green, states like Texas, states like Florida, states like Alabama, these are what we deem non-strict voter ID states. So what that means is they could accept student IDs, they could accept out-of-state IDs, they could accept expired IDs. It varies state by state, as you can tell by the different colors on the map. And then here in Georgia, where a lot of us are, where I'm based out of, this is a strict voter ID state. So you do need some form of photo ID to participate in the election. And so this just kind of discusses some of the changes we've seen across the country around voter ID and how voting has gotten harder for folks across the board. Over 90 plus bills in 30 plus states have been introduced to make voting harder in those states. As of June 2022, nearly 24 states have enacted new or stricter voter ID laws, Georgia being one of those states. And so here at Vote Riders, whenever we see those changes, we hop into action, making sure that our website is up to date with those new voter ID laws, that the information we're providing to our partners, information we're providing voters that call into our helpline. So we are that authority around voter ID and making sure that folks are prepared whenever these changes do occur. Here in Georgia, a lot of you probably heard about SB 202. I know some of the presenters that spoke about it, but there's a lot of things in SB 202 that changed voting that came into effect at the beginning of 2021. One of the things that was in SB 202 related to voter ID is it changed how you voted by mail. Georgia before SB 202 was a signature match state. So if the signature on your absentee ballot matched what they had on file for your voter registration, that would they would count your absentee ballot. Since SB 202, now when voters want to vote by mail, they have to send in either their driver's license or state ID number, or a copy of the ID they plan to use with their absentee ballot application. And then again, when they get their absentee ballot and they send that back, they again have to provide their driver's license number or their state ID number, or again, the copy of the ID they want to use to vote. And so that is a big change for folks who cast a ballot in 2020 who may not have participated in local elections in 2021. And so here at Vote Riders, we're making sure that folks are aware of this, because we saw in the primary that was earlier this year, the second highest reason that absentee ballots were rejected is because folks had issues with their identification, either not providing the number, not providing the correct number, or not providing an ID. And so that big change led to a big increase in those rejected ballots. And so we want to make sure that folks are prepared and knowledgeable about this change. So that is how they choose to exercise their right. They know how to do that and do so successfully. So let's just talk about some of the numbers here in Georgia. The number on the top, 155,000. Here at Vote Riders, we have done a campaign that we've been working on this year through text banking, letter writing, other means of outreach. And these are voters that are registered. We got this list from the Secretary of State's office, but they don't have an ID on file. That doesn't necessarily mean they don't have an ID, but a lot of the people we've contacted, reached out to, they needed ID assistance, and we've been able to help them secure that ID, pay for the ID, pay for supporting documents like a birth certificate, pay for a ride to and from the DDS here in Georgia. And so we've been able to help them along the way. And we've been doing targeted outreach to those folks because that's a really big number. And we found out that some of those folks had ID. They needed to update their voter profiles, things of that nature. But we wanted them to be aware so they didn't run into issues when they wanted to cast their ballot. The number you're seeing at the bottom, 820,000. That's how many voting age citizens who do not have a current government issued photo ID in Georgia. You'll see I have some numbers coming up on the next slide as well, but when you see that many voters that need assistance that don't have an ID for whatever reason, that can swing an election. And you know that if you're paying attention in 2020, how close it was in Georgia. And again, these numbers speak to the numbers that we saw in 2020, 2.6 million registered voters did not participate in the general election in Georgia. That's so many folks. A lot of these folks you just saw from the numbers that were on the previous screen, they don't have ID, and that some folks set out for other reasons. But the point is, we want to make sure that people that want to have a voice, part of having that voice in Georgia is having an ID. And so we don't want that to be a hurdle here at Vote Riders. And so we are providing that assistance to voters. And then lastly, the smallest number that we'll talk about is around 12,000 votes decided the presidential election here in 2020. And so when you think about all the big numbers that we saw, the numbers of voters that were registered that didn't have an ID on file, the number of voting age citizens in Georgia who don't have an ID, and then the number of folks that sat out of these elections in 2020, that makes a big difference. And you see that 12,000 is multiple times in that 2.6 million. So there's so many people that need to have a voice, and we want to make sure that they do so that we can get the most accurate outcome for our elections. So here in Georgia, there are several IDs that you can use to cast your ballots successfully when you have to provide voter IDs. So we're going to talk about some of those IDs right now. Of course, in Georgia, in any state, that state's driver's license. So Georgia driver's license is the most common form of ID. That is one of the only forms of ID that can be expired. When you present it again, is for identification, it does not have to be up to date. The other ones that you see with the asterisk, they must be current. So your Georgia state ID, if you have that instead of a driver's license, that must be up to date. If you have a driver's license or a state ID from another state, if you've moved to Fort Valley, or if you moved to Albany State, if you moved to Morehouse, or you moved to Spelman from out of state, you can use that ID to vote. Again, that's not just for residency, it's to prove who you are and that you are the person registered going to cast that ballot. A free Georgia voter ID card. This is something that the state of Georgia offers to voters who don't have any other form of ID. You can go to your local elections office, you can go to the DDS and request this ID. You do have to provide a lot of the same documents that you need when you're trying to get a state ID or a driver's license. And so we always encourage folks that reach out to us to try to get that state ID or driver's license because it can be used in other forms. The Georgia voter ID card can only be used for voting purposes. But again, if that is the only option, we do get that for voters in need. U.S. passport, if you have a passport, that can be used as well. A military ID. If you're an employee of the government, the U.S. government, any Georgia entity, so a state, the state, the county, a city, you can use that employee ID as well. You have a tribal ID. And then, of course, unique to all the folks on this call, student ID. Student ID is accepted from public universities, colleges, technical schools, listed by a list on the Secretary of State. Of course, you can find that list on the Secretary of State. But that is so key because a lot of the folks that are in Georgia, a lot of our brothers and sisters at HBCUs don't have the ability to use their ID, and we're going to talk about that a little more. So who can use their student ID? And again, as I mentioned, if you go to a public university, a technical school, you're able to use that ID. But if you go to a private institution, you're not going to be able to use that ID for voting purposes. For example, I know there are some folks from Fort Valley, Albany State on the call. Those are public universities in the state of Georgia. So those students can use their ID as voter ID if they choose when they go to the polls. Now, if we talk about our brothers and sisters at the AUC, so Morehouse, Clark, Atlanta, Spelman, none of them can use their ID as voting ID because that is a private institution. And so that can possibly disenfranchise a lot of the young students at those schools. And of course, getting registered is part of being in the conversation. But here in Georgia and other voter ID states, making sure you have an ID that you can use is essential. I know I'm not too far removed from college. I went to an HBCU myself, go HU, but folks lose their ID. You could leave it somewhere. You could leave it in the library when you're studying. You could leave it at your friend's house, and use it when you're out on a weekend or a Friday night. And so it's so important and so essential to have multiple forms of ID as possible so you can be prepared. And so unfortunately here in Georgia, students that go to private institutions like the ones we mentioned, also you can include schools like Emory, they aren't able to use their ID. But if you look across the pond, especially for the students in Atlanta, if they look at folks right down the street at Georgia State, Georgia Tech, they're able to use their ID to vote. And so that is why we always make a push here at Vote Riders to make sure we're engaging with young students, African-American students, students on college campuses, because they need that ID. And here in Georgia specifically, they are impacted by the ID laws that they have set up. So of course, I know you're going to hear this from me. You're going to hear this from a lot of other folks that speak, but wanted to highlight some of the key dates around the election. Of course, you can already start requesting your absentee ballot. That's key because, again, the absentee ballot request laws have changed, especially when we talk about voter ID laws. They have shortened that period, but it is important that you add that ID number or a copy of your ID when you are sending in that absentee ballot request. You don't want it to be rejected, and then if you find out it's rejected or there's an issue, you want to make sure that you have time to submit that application, because that application deadline, if you want to vote absentee, is on October 28th. If you are voting absentee, I always encourage folks, again, to send it in as soon as possible. As soon as you get it, don't let it sit on the table for too long. Fill it out. Of course, do your research about who's on your ballot, who you're voting for. Make sure you're a knowledgeable voter, but send that in. Again, that's just to make sure that you alleviate if there's any issues, that you're able to clear that ballot to make sure that it is successfully cast. And then lastly, last day to register to vote is October 11th. So if you are not registered, if you know someone that's not registered, if you have a friend, a classmate, a family member, make sure you get them registered. Make sure that they have the documents they need to successfully cast this ballot. They say this every year. 2022 is an important election year. Every year is important, and it's always important to make sure your voice is heard. So make sure that if you know anybody that is waiting, saying they're going to do it tomorrow, sit with them. There's so many ways they can do it, especially if they already have a driver's license, a Georgia driver's license, or Georgia state ID. They can use that to register online. For folks without that, they can't use the online portal, but it's still important for to help them do that through those steps to successfully be registered for the upcoming election. And then, of course, early voting is between October 17th and October 30th. Again, so however you want to exercise your vote right. If you want to vote early, you want to vote on election day, you want to vote by mail, just make sure that you have a plan, make sure that you stick to that plan, and then you have a backup plan. So those are some of the voting. The early voting period, I know that some folks, a lot of college students, I know when I was in college up in Washington, D.C., I did a lot of absentee voting back here in Georgia because I was never home during an election day. And then lastly, election day is November 8th. Mark your calendars. Again, if you plan to vote on election day, bring a friend, ask your roommate, ask somebody who may need to also have their voice heard. It's a great conversation to have. Part of that conversation that you have, that dialogue that you have with your friends and family, should be around voting, not just in election years, because there's always going to be an election, whether it's local, federal, a midterm, presidential election. There's always going to be something around the corner. So this should be part of the conversations that you're having in the lunchroom, having at the dining table, having while you're sitting playing 2K with your friends, whatever the case may be. You want to make sure that you are prepared. And of course, I just spoke to that on the last side, being prepared, having that plan, having the ID is part of your plan, however you decide to vote, whether that is by mail, in person, early, or on election day, you need that ID. And again, Vote Riders is here to help anybody in Georgia that needs assistance getting an ID. I know there are college students who may need an ID, who may have lost their ID. And of course, as I mentioned, Vote Riders covers those expenses. They need something like a birth certificate, we will cover the expense of getting a birth certificate for them. They need a social security card, any supporting documents, we will help them secure that. We will give them a ride to the DDS, to and from, pay for that through our Uber or Lyft account for them. And then, of course, we will pay for that student's ID or driver's license that they need. So again, make sure that you are aware of this. Make sure that you let your friends and family know that Vote Riders is here to be a resource to anyone that needs ID in the state of Georgia and across the board. If you have friends, family members that are in other states, we work with voters across the country to make sure that they have the ID that they need, no matter if they are in a voter ID state or not. And so taking action, that is half the battle, making sure folks step up. Informational campaigns, always encourage folks, especially younger folks, to follow us on our social media. It's at Vote Riders across all platforms, whether you're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we're newly on TikTok, but we want to share that information with you. We have great infographics. We have great information about voter ID, and it's great to repost that because you never know who in your network may need help getting an ID. You never know who you're going to impact, and there's so many folks across the board that need this type of help. And so when you share that, you never know who might reach out to Vote Riders for that assistance. Direct voter partnerships. This is when we work with community organizations. We love working on college campuses. We work with homeless shelters, organizations that work with returning citizens. We want to be on the front lines with people who need the ID the most. We talked about it earlier in the presentations, folks who are disproportionately impacted by voter ID laws. We want to make sure that we are upfront and personal with them, helping them through the process. We do things called voter ID clinics, where we sit down, we start with figuring out what they need. If they need that birth certificate, we order it. If they need the ride, we sit down and figure out a time that works for their schedule to arrange a ride so we can get them to the DDS to pay for those documents. And so, of course, we encourage you, if you are a campus organization, if you work with an organization in the community, reach out to Vote Riders. We want to make sure that we're partnering with you to provide this service to the folks you're engaged with. And then phone banking, text banking, letter writing. This is the targeted outreach we do in the state of Georgia. We have other target states that we work on, but we're making sure that we are letting as many people know the voter ID laws in their state and telling them that Vote Riders is that resource or help. I talked about that list of 155,000 registered voters. We have been doing targeted text things, targeted letter writing parties to these voters, making sure that they get this information. We've had great outreach from the people that have connected with that said that they need that ID, that they need assistance. We've been able to provide that for them. And then we've had people that reached out and said, hey, I didn't even know I was on this list. They updated their registration information. And so this has been very powerful to making sure that more voices are going to be heard in November. And so we love to have as many folks participating in that work with us. So that is just some way that you can do some of this targeted outreach to Georgia voters. And then voter ID clinics, similar to our direct voter partnerships, we go into community places, we go on college campuses, we go to homeless shelters, we go to work with returning citizens, we go to barbershops, libraries, and we are providing that assistance. We're figuring out what that voter needs, where they're at in the process, and helping them get across the finish line. And so, again, you can be a part of that. There's so many kids on college campuses that may have lost their ID, may have never had an ID. I know when I went to Howard, I met a lot of folks from Pennsylvania, from New York, who never had a state ID. And so their first ID that they got was from Washington, D.C. And so there's so many folks that are impacted that you don't know that you may be speaking to every day. And so that is what our clinics are for, to be on the ground, to engage with them and to provide that assistance. And again, what you're seeing now is just some of the work that we've done here at Vote Riders, some of our partners that we've engaged with, and the impact that we're having, trying to build that footprint, make sure that people know about Vote Riders, know who to turn to, know to call us if they have any questions or concerns around voter ID. And again, that is just continued on this page. You'll see some of the in-person stuff we've done. We do a lot of virtual work as well. Our text banks, our letter writing parties, those are virtual events. We do some of those in person as well, but it's a way to galvanize. You just pull up your Zoom like we're on now, and then we train you on how to make sure you're sending the letters, all of that great stuff, the platform that we use, and then we ask you to send those out and have that impact in your community. So there's so many ways you can step up, especially here in Georgia. You can step up in person, you can step up online, but there's so many ways to engage with Vote Riders and the work that we're doing. And so, of course, contact Vote Riders, our helpline. Our helpline is very important. Anybody who has a question around voter ID, who needs assistance, they can reach out via call or text to our helpline 24 hours a day. That number is 844-338-8743. Please tell folks to reach out, give us a call if they need help or if they have any questions around voter ID in their state. Then our website is voteriders.org. You can go there. We have an interactive map that talks about all of the voter ID laws in all the states across the country, whether they have those ID laws or not. So it's a great map for folks that may be confused and want to know the acceptable forms of ID that they can bring to the polls. Again, they can also find a contact form where they can reach out to Vote Riders for assistance, find other ways to get involved, great information, find information about real ID. A lot of folks may have questions about that and things of that nature. So there's so much great information to find on the website that can be impactful and useful to you and your community. And then lastly, Sylvester@voteriders.org. That is my email. If you want to do some work here in Georgia, if you want to be on the ground having that impact, please reach out to me. I have another staff member that works with me. We have great volunteers that we've built up that are going to be providing services, helping with these voter ID clinics, giving you our info cards, making sure that the people that you're working with are prepared to have their voice heard. And again, I just spoke about the ways you can reach out to us. Follow us again on social media at Vote Riders across all platforms. We're trying to build up that community, make sure that we're spreading that word to as many folks as possible. Visit our website and of course, shoot me an email if you do have any questions. But with that being said, I have completed my presentation. I will open the floor. I think I have about 5 more minutes or so if there's any questions around voter ID. But again, it's so important that you all are here. I'm so thankful that these young folks are engaged, ready to be that source of knowledge on their campus and their community. And that is, I hope you all continue to enjoy this day of impact and learning from all the others great organizations. So I will be quiet for a little and see if there are any other questions in the chat.
Hey, Sylvester, it's Ken Gassett from Georgia Southern University. Quick question, if that's okay for you.
Yes.
I was curious, are there any sites specifically with the state of Georgia that organizations that compile candidate information? So as students or others are trying to be an informed voter, and I appreciate you mentioning it several times, just when you're getting registered to vote and however you're choosing to vote, that you're going into that vote with a good understanding of how candidates feel. And do you know if there's a common site or good references to direct students to that help them to adequately look up information about candidates?
Off the top of my head, I wouldn't say yes. I know when I log into my voter page, they always provide me with a sample ballot and then tell me the precincts that I'm voting for. Sometimes it's not always made easy, the steps you need to take, but that's part of being an informed voter, taking those necessary steps. So you can look at your sample ballot, look at the precincts or look at your local districts, and then take that next step, see who's on the ballot or who's running for representing different parties, or if it's a nonpartisan position, and then do it that way. There probably are some of those good resources. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any, but those are some of the steps I take, looking at my precinct card, looking at my sample ballot, and then doing some Google searches, looking at the information that comes up, looking at those candidates on websites to see what their platform are, see where they stand, and then making an informed decision. Great question. So if I don't see any more questions from anyone, I think that concludes my time for my presentation. Again, I thank you all for joining me during your lunch hour. Hopefully you got some food, got some snacks, and you're prepared for the last half of this impactful virtual event. And hopefully I'll see some of you all in person tomorrow as well. I will kick it back over to, I guess, Sierra or somebody from campus voter project.
Thank you, Sylvester. That was an amazing presentation.